Welcome, Mr. Spangenberg. The issue of this evening is a green economy within the planetary boundaries. My first question would be, a green economy, in your opinion, what is this about, and does there exist something like a green economy?
Well, from my point of view, a green economy does not yet exist. However, of course, environmental movements and politicians and many other parts of civil society have been arguing for greening the economy for the last 30 years. At least since the limits to growth, we know that there is a need to green the economy. So that is a necessary condition for any kind of sustainable development, but it is by far not sufficient just to green the economy. What we need is also what is in the title of this evening, is setting limits.
Mm-hmm. What we see in Europe itself, in the policy of Europe invested also in the TEEP report, which is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and there we see an approach putting monetary value on ecosystem services, bringing them into the market, and then by this way, putting a price on it to limit the use of these ecosystem services and to conserve a certain sustainable level of these ecosystems. Do you think this is the right approach, and do you think the market has to organize this?
Well, first of all, to do justice to the TEEP report, there is much more in it than only monetizing ecosystem services and biodiversity. However, this is one of the core messages. And I think this message is based on a number of significant, deep misunderstandings. First of all, the assumption is that by preserving ecosystem services, and services are flows, that is what economists can measure, by measuring these flows, biodiversity would be preserved. Scientific results show that preserving biodiversity helps conserving ecosystem services, but not necessarily the other way around. So if we try to focus on ecosystem services, which we also need to preserve, no question about that, we just tend to neglect the importance of biodiversity. So that will not work. Secondly, we have certain experience with markets, for example, the speculation in the financial markets, which has led to the big collapse 2007-2008. We see now that in the market for carbon dioxide, under the European emission trading scheme, similar things are happening. Banks begin to use that as speculation objects, and by using it for speculation, the economic incentives which result are not longer as expected good for the environment, but bad for the environment. And now we try to repeat exactly the same thing for biodiversity. So we are repeating mistakes we already have made. And furthermore, biodiversity is a local achievement, a local asset, and nothing which can be traded on the international scale. So while there may be very many useful economic incentives motivating people like fees or taxes or things like that, strengthening protection of the environment, it is by no means the main and efficient way of achieving a sustainable, environmentally sustainable world.
Mm-hmm. And where do you see approaches or mechanisms to guarantee these boundaries, these planetary boundaries?
Well, let's start with where they are not. Having returned from Rio de Janeiro and monitored the discussions over there, the governments of the world talk about sustained growth, permanent growth. In the European Union, we always talk about eco-efficiency or resource efficiency for growth and employment. If you look at what engineers and experts say, with better technology, we may be able to reduce the resource consumption per unit of GDP, and that is a key indicator the European Commission is now defining for its eco-efficiency strategy. We may be able to reduce the resource consumption per unit of GDP by about 50%, which is significant, which will be a great thing. However, having a growth rate of 3% per year would mean that all this achievement is eradicated already before 2040. And we know that, you know that we have to reduce our CO2 emissions 50% by 2050. So the growth rate is by far overcompensating any efficiency gains. So efficiency is right, it's a point to start, it's important, it's non-negligible, it's really a good thing to do, but it is by far not enough. What we need is capping, a strict capping of resource consumption, otherwise the environmental degradation will not be stopped. However, capping leads to distributional problems, because if you cannot promise growth anymore, then you cannot promise that anybody is able to catch up. If they are not catch up, then the question of justice cannot be answered sometime in the future. It must be answered by redistribution of the existing stuff. And that means that it's in the end very much a political and a social problem to solve the environmental problems. So this must go hand in hand, and this is why sustainability is so important, because that integrates these different dimensions.
Yeah. So we have also to put in center stage the question of equity.
Without justice and without equity, there is no sustainability by definition, and without better justice and better social justice in Europe, we will not be able to implement the drastic changes in consumption and production which are needed from an environmental point of view. In the European Union member countries, the idea what is a just distribution of income is very different. But there is one thing all 27 member countries' populations agree, that the current distribution is unjust. And as long as that is the case, and we do not change that, and work for betterment, people will not be ready to carry additional burdens for environmental restructuring. So both things must go hand in hand, otherwise it won't work out.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people in Rio de Janeiro on the summit of Rio +20, but what was lacking was like a sense of urgency. So I have the impression that even the civil society doesn't know right today where to heading in which direction. It was also a consideration of Komi Naidu of Greenpeace International, who was saying there in Rio, also civil society need to take time for reflection.
Well, if you look at the government negotiations, it was really one of the biggest jokes I've ever seen, because the head of state flying in flew to a negotiation which they knew upon arrival would never take place. So that was the most expensive cabaret which the world has seen, with the biggest audience and the lowest level of entertainment. No, that was really not politics. The diplomats negotiating were from governments in around the world, and they were representing the three fractions of the global consumer class: the rich in the south, the privileged ones, the elites of the north, in East and in the US and Europe. These are the people which indeed are benefiting from the situation. Of course, they have no urgency in changing it. The question is, how do we manage to get real democracy? Because people, ordinary people, farmers throughout the world, Africa, Asia, wherever we ask them, they feel the need. They feel it in their everyday life. They see what needs to be done. So the question is one of global democracy, and I think civil society should be well aware that it makes itself pretty superfluous if it is not spearheading this drive to more responsible democracy around the world, and just waiting for things to happen and pushing realistic policy aims.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for this interview.
It's a pleasure.